On the border, where the sun beat down on the ground, testing nerves of steel, Sergeant Jackson Kramer bit his lip and held Sophie Watson, a young black woman with a determined look, at gunpoint. Her hands, raised in a sign of unarmedness, shook not with fear but with genuine rage. "You know this neighborhood is no place for your kind?" Kramer hissed, his voice a taut string, his eyes blazing with cold prejudice as he pushed her toward the patrol car. But then, in the distance, he heard the roar of engines. A column of UN vehicles was slowly approaching, like a harbinger of change. Kramer tensed, his anger soaring. "What do they want here?" he growled, his hatred for every outsider swelling in his chest. Sophie, feeling the tension growing, glanced at the approaching cars full of peacekeepers, who were unaware that something more than just an arrest was happening at the border at that moment. How do you think this meeting will end? Write your names in the comments and where you are watching this video from. You are very important to us and your support helps us develop our channel. Let's fight bias together. Enjoy watching. At the border, where the sand and heat blinded the sky and the earth, Sergeant Jackson Kramer leaned against his patrol SUV. His dark blue glasses did not hide the wicked glint in his eyes as he stared at Sophie Watson, a black woman trying to pass through the checkpoint. Her face was puzzled, her shoulders tense with fear and anger. Kramer growled, raising his eyebrows, "This is no place for your kind." Sophie looked him in the eye stubbornly. "I'm just trying to cross the border. I have all the documents. Why are you holding me back?" "Papers? You think I care about your papers?" he sneered, leaning closer so that his breath felt like a cold wind. "You shouldn't be here. Get out before it gets worse." Sophie clenched her fists, feeling fear trying to overwhelm her, but she couldn't let that happen. "I have a right to be here. You can't just arrest people just because they don't like the color of their skin." At that moment, the roar of engines could be heard from somewhere far away. Kramer turned around abruptly, his face distorted with anger. The column of UN vehicles was slowly approaching, like an ominous shadow covering everything around. "What the hell?" he growled, his voice shaking with rage. "Who needs them here? They'll only get in the way." "Aren't you ashamed?" Sophie said, feeling the tension build. "Maybe they're here to help people like me?" Kramer leaned toward her, his eyes blazing with hatred. "You have no right to talk to me about helping you. Get out, or I'll make you regret ever being here." She felt her heart pounding in her chest, but she couldn't look away. "You can't just bully me like that. I'm not alone. I'll fight for my rights." Kramer seemed to be losing control. He turned toward his car, rage pounding in his temples. "I'm not going to let this convoy interfere with my work. I'm in charge here." As soon as he said these words, shadows fell from the sky. UN personnel began to get out of their cars, and their white uniforms, like ghosts, moved towards them. Kramer, overcome with rage, looked at them with hatred, as if they were enemies ready to destroy him. "Do you hear that?" he said, turning to Sophie. "Are these your allies? They won't save you. I won't let that happen." Sophie felt the fear turn into something else, anger, determination. "I'm not afraid of you, Sergeant. You can't break me." At that moment, Kramer pulled out the handcuffs, his hands shaking with rage. "You thought you could get away? You're wrong." The sun beat down on them and the air was tense, as if it was about to explode. Sophie knew that this moment would determine everything, her future, her struggle, and what was happening here on the border. Kramer, his face twisted with anger, felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He glanced at the peacekeepers who were gathering around him, their eyes full of determination. They weren't going to back down, and that only fueled his rage. "You all think you can stop me?" he shouted, raising his baton, his voice a warning. "I can have you all arrested for interfering with lawful activities." Sophia, feeling fear creeping into her heart, gathered all her courage. "You have no right to do this. You are only showing your hatred," she shouted, trying to take a step forward. But Kramer was already at his wit's end. "You can't talk to me like that," he screamed, his hands shaking with rage. "I'm in charge here, and you'll pay for your words." He took a step toward her, and in that moment, something inside Sophie broke. She saw his anger boil over, and hers turned into determination. "I'm not afraid of you. I'm not alone, and I won't give up," she said, her voice filled with power. Kramer, his breathing heavy and ragged, began to panic. He turned sharply to the peacekeepers. "You have no right to be here. Get out before I arrest you." His voice sounded like thunder. One of the peacekeepers, tall and confident, stepped forward. "Sergeant, you are violating this woman's rights. We cannot ignore this." Kramer, losing control, rushed towards them. "You will all pay for your interference." His voice sounded like a threat. At that moment, he raised his club and slammed it on the ground in rage, creating a dull sound that echoed throughout the surrounding area like an ominous warning. Sophia felt her heart beat faster. She knew there was violence in the air, and it could end badly. "You can't intimidate us, Kramer," she screamed. "You're wrong if you think your hatred can win." Kramer, his face red with anger, stepped closer. "You're the problem. I'm here to maintain order, and you're just a useless person trying to make me the villain." But his words no longer had power. Sophie, surrounded by peacekeepers, felt supported. "We are together. We are not alone," she cried, and her voice became a bright torch in the darkness. Kramer, realizing that he was losing control, suddenly screamed, "I'll put you all behind bars. You don't understand what you're dealing with." His rage grew into madness. He waved his club, and fear gripped those around him. At this point, one of the peacekeepers, realizing that he had to act, stepped forward. "Sergeant, if you don't calm down, we'll be forced to call for backup. This will end badly for you." Kramer, panicked, looked at Sophie, his eyes filled with hatred. "You will all pay," he screamed, as if he had lost the last of his sanity. He rushed towards her again, but at that moment the peacekeepers took a decisive step forward, and one of them grabbed his arm, trying to stop him. Sophia felt her fear growing, but her determination only grew stronger. "I will not give up. I will fight for my life and for everyone who suffers from your hatred," she screamed, her voice booming like thunder. Kramer, torn between anger and fear, suddenly faltered. Thoughts raged in his head about losing everything: his job, his power, and most importantly, his pride. "You'll all regret this," he shouted, but his words sounded unconvincing. At this point, the peacekeepers, seeing the situation getting out of control, began to act decisively. "Sergeant, you need to calm down and back off," one of them said, his voice full of insistence. "You've already crossed the line." Sophia, feeling her strength growing, took a step forward. "This fight is not just mine. It belongs to everyone who faces racism and violence. We will not let you intimidate us anymore." Kramer, seeing his power disintegrate, froze for a moment. Panic flashed in his eyes. "You don't know what you're doing. This is my territory," he shouted, but it didn't matter anymore. Sophia realized that this was her chance. "We will not remain silent anymore. We are defending our rights, and you will not be able to stop us." At this point, the peacekeepers, realizing their time had come, surrounded Kramer, their voices ringing out as one, full of determination. "Sergeant, your actions will be investigated, and you will not escape consequences." Kramer, realizing that his time was up, took one last look at Sophie. A shadow of fear flickered in his eyes, and in that moment he realized that everything had changed. Kramer, still consumed by rage, suddenly felt the tension in the air change. Sophie's words echoed in his mind, and he froze for a moment, realizing that her determination might be stronger than his hatred. "You think you can just walk away from this border?" he shouted, but his voice was no longer so confident. Sophie, tensing, realized that this moment could be a turning point. "I'm not running away. I'm here to stand up for my rights," she replied, stepping forward, together with the peacekeepers and everyone who wants justice. At this point, the peacekeepers, seeing that Kramer was losing control, began to act. One of them, a tall man with soft features, came closer. "Sergeant, you are breaking the law. This woman has a right to protection," he said confidently. Kramer, feeling that he was surrounded, flared up again. "I am doing my duty. You have no right to interfere with my actions," he shouted, but without the confidence he had had before. Sophie felt her inner fire rise. "This isn't just my fight. This is ours," she said, her voice a powerful cry. "We will no longer remain silent when we see injustice." The peacekeepers began to discuss the situation among themselves, and this gave Sophie even more confidence. "Together we can change this," she added, turning to those gathered around. Kramer, his rage mixed with fear, froze. He had not expected that a simple woman could affect his confidence so much. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he shouted, but his words already sounded like a cry of despair. Sophia continued, I know what it is to struggle. I know what it is to be rejected. But we have the right to freedom and justice. Her voice filled the space, and sparks of hope appeared in the eyes of those around her. One of the peacekeepers, realizing that Sophie was becoming the center of this conflict, stepped forward. We are here to support you. We will not allow this outrage to continue, he said, his voice full of determination. Kramer, realizing that he was losing control, suddenly grabbed his baton. You will all regret your actions, he shouted, but the peacekeepers were already ready. Sergeant, if you don't calm down, we'll have to detain you, one of the peacekeepers said, his voice a loud and clear order. The situation had reached its limit, and the tension in the air was almost palpable. Sophia, feeling supported, stepped closer to the peacekeepers. I'm not alone, we're all together, she cried, her voice sounding like a spark, igniting a fire in the hearts of others. Let's show that hate will not win. At that moment, Kramer, realizing that his threat was not working, froze in place. He looked at the crowd and saw determination in their eyes. This was not just one woman's fight. This was a manifesto for justice. Sophia stepped forward, confident in herself and in her rightness. We demand respect. We demand justice, she said, and her words echoed around everyone. The assembled peacekeepers, activists, and even bystanders began to rise, supporting her cry for justice. A sense of unity appeared in their eyes, and together they stood up to defend the rights that were being taken away. Kramer, realizing that his power had evaporated, suddenly felt a crowd closing in on him. You are all wrong, he shouted, but his words no longer had any power. At that moment, when fear and hatred began to give way to justice, the peacekeepers stepped forward, ready to end this fight. The crowd began to rally around Sophie, and her courage became a catalyst for others. People who had previously stood aside now joined her, raising their voices in support. We're here to protect each other, one man shouted, joining the chorus of demands for justice. Kramer, panicked, tried desperately to maintain control. Get away from her. It's none of your business, he shouted, but his words were already sounding like gibberish. He looked at the peacekeepers who were now surrounding him and realized that they weren't going to back down. Sergeant, if you don't stop this aggression, we will be forced to detain you, the peacekeeper said again, his voice calm despite the tension of the situation. Kramer, seeing that his threat was not working, rushed to his car, trying to get reinforcements. You will pay for all of this, he growled, but fear had already taken hold of him. Sophie, sensing that this was the moment of truth, stepped forward. You cannot intimidate us any longer, she cried, and her voice was a powerful appeal. A crowd began to gather around her, her support becoming clear. We will fight for justice, people cried, and it created a ripple effect, strengthening everyone's resolve. Kramer, realizing that his sole power was fading, took one last look at the peacekeepers and the crowd. I'll arrest you all, he shouted, but his voice sounded increasingly uncertain. You can try, one of the peacekeepers replied, determination in his eyes, but we are here to stop any violence and protect this woman's rights. Sophia felt her heart fill with hope. We can change this, she said, and her words echoed through the crowd. Let's come together and show that hate has no power against unity. People began to rise, their voices merging into one stream. Justice for all, they shouted, and at that moment the crowd was filled with energy, ready to confront any evil. Kramer finally realized that his time was up. He turned sharply to his colleagues, but there was no longer any confidence in his eyes. Are you all against me? He asked, as if seeking support, but saw only doubt and fear. The peacekeepers surrounding him began to take action. Sergeant, we cannot allow you to continue this activity, one of them said, stepping closer. We will take you into custody if you do not calm down. Sophia, feeling that everything was changing, raised her head. This is our victory, she cried, and the crowd responded with loud approval. We have not been silent, and we will not be silent. Kramer, seeing that he had no way out, threw his club to the ground in despair. Okay, I won't fight, he said, but his words no longer sounded convincing. The crowd screamed with joy, and Sophie realized that the fight for justice was beginning to bear fruit. She felt that this was only the beginning. We will make a difference. We will fight until the end, she exclaimed, and her voice sounded like the music of hope. The peacekeepers took Kramer into custody, and the crowd began to applaud. This was not just one woman's victory, it was the beginning of a new era of fighting for rights and justice. Sophie looked at the crowd and knew that they were stronger than ever. Those gathered around Sophie continued to applaud and support her, and there was a light of hope in their eyes. This moment became a symbol of resistance against oppression and hatred. Sophie felt her heart fill with pride that she was able to unite people for a common goal. The peacekeepers, satisfied that Kramer was no longer a threat, began issuing instructions. We will monitor this situation, and if anyone else decides to break the law, we will be ready to act, one of them said, his voice full of confidence. Sophia stepped forward, feeling the tensions slowly dissipate. Today we showed that together we can make a difference, she said, addressing the crowd. We must continue to fight for rights, for justice for all who face such abuse. People began to rise, and her words awakened in them the desire to act. Yes, we are together, they shouted in unison. It sounded like a powerful anthem that filled the atmosphere with unity and determination. Voices rose up from the crowd. What can we do to help? One of the women asked, her eyes filled with genuine concern. Sophie smiled as people began to rally and replied, we need to organize meetings to discuss how we can support each other and act in the future. Gradually, people began to gather around, discussing ideas and suggestions. Someone suggested creating a support group for victims of racism. Others talked about the importance of informing the public about what was happening. Sophie realized that this was not just an impulse, but the beginning of a new movement. A man appeared from the crowd and introduced himself as a journalist. I heard something important is happening here. Can I interview you? He asked, his camera already at the ready. Sophie was a little tense, but decided that this was a great way to get her thoughts across to a wider audience. Of course, she replied, trying to keep her voice confident. We need to talk about what's going on. It's important for all of us. She began to tell her story, about how she was arrested, the hatred she faced, and how she decided to speak out. The journalist recorded her every word, and spectators began to gather around, listening to her story with great interest. This is not just my story, this is the story of many people who suffer injustice, she said, her voice taking on new strength. The crowd burst into applause again. We will support you, we are with you, they shouted, and this created an atmosphere of solidarity. As soon as the interview ended, Sophie noticed that the peacekeepers were discussing the situation with other police officers who had arrived on the scene. She knew that the fight was not over and that their actions could be the beginning of something bigger. We need to keep going, she told the group gathered around her. We need to raise awareness, organize rallies and show that we will not tolerate violence and hatred. People nodded in agreement with her. They began to discuss how best to organize their actions, what resources they could use, and who could help in this fight. Sophia sensed that this energy was a nascent force. She realized that they were not simply rebelling against one man, but were fighting for a more just society. Let's form a group that will work on this issue, she suggested, and the suggestion was met with enthusiastic responses. Soon, several people gathered to discuss the details. They decided that their first goal would be to organize a rally to draw attention to the problems of racism and injustice that many people face. We need to get our message heard, one of the women said, and everyone agreed. And so began a new chapter in their fight. Sophie knew there was much work ahead, but with each new step, she felt a community growing around her, ready to fight for justice, and that energy inspired her to take new actions. As the crowd continued to discuss plans, Sophie looked around. She saw faces full of hope and determination. This was the moment that would change her life forever, and she knew that together they could make the change they were looking for. While Sophie and the crowd discussed plans for the rally, the atmosphere in the area remained tense. Although Kramer had been detained, his rage had not subsided. At that moment, as peacekeepers began to lead him to police cars, a sinister idea began to form in his head. Despite the peacekeepers' support, Kramer knew he had to take every opportunity to escape their grasp. He noticed one of the officers distracted, discussing the situation with other officers. This was his opportunity. Suddenly, as the peacekeepers were turning away, Kramer pushed one of them with all his might and threw himself to the side. I won't let you hold me back, he shouted, his voice sounding like a curse. At that moment, as if on cue, his supporters began to intervene. Sophie, sensing the situation was getting heated, turned her attention to the commotion. "What's going on?" she asked, looking in fear towards where Kramer was trying to escape. She saw him struggling in the hands of the peacekeepers, his face contorted with hatred. Kramer, taking advantage of the confusion, rushed towards an abandoned warehouse nearby. "I'll be back," he growled, his words filled with menace. "You'll all pay for this." The crowd froze, feeling fear. "He might try to attack us," one of the women whispered, creating a wave of panic. Sophie, realizing that they might all be in danger now, raised her hands. "Calm down, we can't give him power over us." Meanwhile, Kramer, hidden in the shadows of the warehouse, took a deep breath, his brain working at full capacity. He knew that his only chance was to gather supporters who would support his hatred of those who opposed him. "I am not alone," he whispered, his eyes filled with determination. Among the people who had previously supported him, others began to emerge who shared his views. He quickly gathered a small group who decided that revenge was needed. "We can take back control. These people think they can ignore us," he shouted, his words being picked up and amplified. Sophia, noticing that some in the crowd were starting to get nervous, knew it was time to act. "Let's organize. We need to protect ourselves," she shouted, her voice once again becoming the center of attention. "We won't let him intimidate us." Soon the peacekeepers and police, realizing that Kramer had escaped, began searching the area, but by this time his group had already occupied part of the warehouse. "We must act quickly," said one of his supporters. "Let them know that we will not let them suppress us." Sophia saw the fear growing in people's eyes and knew something had to be done. "We should create a block around this place," she suggested. "Everyone gather together and stay close." Meanwhile, Kramer, feeling a surge of strength, began to gather reinforcements. He shouted to his supporters, "Let's show these people who's really in charge here." They nodded, and hatred became their only weapon. Soon people began to gather around the warehouse, and the situation became increasingly tense. Sophie noticed that some of them were clearly aggressive. "We must prepare for any outcome," she said, her voice full of determination, but also anxiety. "Come together, we must protect each other," she shouted, and the crowd responded with hope, but the fear continued to grow. "We will not let hate prevail." Kramer, seeing his group gaining strength, felt he was taking back control. "These people need to know that we will not be silent. We will not back down," he roared, and his supporters shouted back, cheering him on. The situation was becoming increasingly tense, and everyone knew that a real battle could break out ahead. Sophie knew that now, more than ever, they needed the strength of unity to stand against hatred and show that justice would always prevail. The situation around the warehouse continued to escalate. The crowd of people who had gathered to support Sophie began to feel fear and uncertainty. Every whisper, every shadow seemed like a threat. Sophie could see some of her supporters wavering, their confidence undermined by the growing aggression. Kramer, inside the warehouse with a few like-minded people, continued to stir up hatred. "These people think they can just ignore us. They want to break us," he shouted, his voice like thunder. "We have to show them that we will not give in." The support for his words resulted in cries of delight from the crowd. This was the moment when their hatred and rage became the only source of strength. They began throwing things into the street, creating barricades to protect themselves from their opponents. "Soon they will understand that we are not alone," one of his supporters shouted, and the crowd echoed his cries. Sophia, feeling the tension rising, tried to calm her group. "Let's not let them provoke us," she said, but her voice was losing its strength amid the cries of hatred. "We must remain united and not give in to their aggression." Meanwhile, Kramer, seeing that the crowd was beginning to lose control, decided to take action. "Time to show them who's boss," he shouted, and his supporters roared back. "We won't let them break us. We'll raise our voices." As soon as his words spread across the square, several people began to move forward, waving flags and posters with aggressive slogans. This only spurred the crowd on, and it became more and more active, ready for action. Sophia realized that the situation was heating up. "We can't let them take the initiative," she screamed. "We have to show that we are peaceful and we want justice, not violence." But her words were drowned out by the shouts of Kramer and his supporters. Suddenly, a sound like a gunshot rang out in the air. It was the signal. Kramer, sensing that the moment had come, raised his hand. "Now we'll show them that we're here," he shouted, Forward. Sophia saw his followers start moving towards her, and her heart began to pound with alarm. We can't give them a chance to attack, she screamed. Gather. Stay together. The crowd around her began to clump together, and fear began to set in. Kramer and his group were closing in, their faces twisted with hatred and determination. Now or never, one of his followers roared, and that spurred the others on. Sophia, realizing that this could be a crucial moment, raised her hands. Remember, we are here for justice. Don't let hate take over, she shouted, trying to keep up the spirit of her group. But with each passing second the tension grew, and soon there was a thud as one of Kramer's supporters collided with a peacekeeper. A struggle ensued, and tension filled the air. People began to shout. Some tried to pull their comrades away from the conflict, but the energy of violence had already filled the square. Kramer, seeing that his plan was working, roared with joy. Forward, we must show these people that we are stronger, he shouted, and his supporters responded with even louder shouts. Sophie, realizing that their unity was on the verge of destruction, took a decisive step forward. We can do this peacefully. We must be stronger than their hatred, she screamed, but her voice was lost in the general chaos. The situation had escalated into street clashes, and there was a sense of danger in the air. Every moment could be decisive, and everyone knew they had to get the situation under control, or it could get out of their hands. The situation in the square was growing tense, and the threat of violence was in the air. But then, as if in response to the growing chaos, the sound of an engine could be heard in the distance. It was a UN convoy, several vehicles with bright blue flags, moving toward the scene of the clash. Sophia felt hope rise in her as she saw the approaching vehicles. Peacekeepers, she shouted, pointing at the convoy. They're here to help. The cars stopped and uniformed peacekeepers stepped out, their faces serious and their understanding of the situation clear. Their presence seemed to have an effect on both sides. People began to stop what they were doing, looking back at the new force that had come to help. Kramer frowned as he saw the convoy. What are they doing here? He whispered, realizing that he now had two opponents, Sophie and the peacekeepers. His supporters were also beginning to lose confidence as they realized that the situation was getting out of control. The peacekeepers quickly assessed the situation. One of them, Captain Lee, stepped forward, trying to get the crowd's attention. We are here to prevent violence and to help you, he said, his voice calm but firm. Please disperse and discuss your problems peacefully. Sophia felt the tension in the air begin to ease. Let's hear them, she shouted, and the crowd paused, considering her words. We don't want violence. We want justice. Kramer, however, was not about to give in. This is our territory. They have no right to interfere, he shouted, but his voice sounded increasingly uncertain. The people began to discuss among themselves, looking at the peacekeepers with hope. Captain Lee moved closer to Kramer and his supporters. We understand that you feel slighted, but violence will not lead to a good outcome. Let's talk about what's bothering you, he suggested, his tone respectful but insistent. Sophia, noticing that some of Kramer's supporters were beginning to waver, decided to move closer. We are all here for one purpose, for justice, she said. Peacekeepers can help us find the right path. Kramer, realizing that his hold on the crowd was beginning to wane, tried to take control of the situation. Don't listen to them. They just want to take what we have, he shouted, but his words sounded increasingly unconvincing. Meanwhile, the peacekeepers began to actively engage with the crowd, offering help and support. Let's form a dialogue, Captain Lee suggested. We are ready to listen to your problems and help find a solution. It is better than violence. Sophia felt that now there really was a chance to change the situation. Let's open up to dialogue. We can work together to solve our problems, she shouted, her voice sounding like a call for unity. Some in the crowd began to nod, their eyes filled with hope. There were conversations of, maybe we should really try this, and let's do this peacefully. These were the moments when fear began to give way to hope. Kramer, noticing his supporters beginning to lose interest in his aggressive line, shouted, Don't let them intimidate you. We're stronger than they think, but his voice sounded increasingly lonely amid the growing agreement in the crowd. Sophia realized that this was her moment. Let's get together and discuss our needs. We must be united, she exclaimed, and the thought began to spread like a wave. The UN convoy continued to be at the center of the action, their presence inspiring hope. and more people began to gather around the peacekeepers, ready to listen to their proposal. The situation was gradually changing, and although Kramer continued to protest, the hope for a peaceful resolution of the situation was becoming more and more real. Sophia felt the energy of unity growing, and she knew that if they could talk, they could overcome hatred. The situation in the square began to change. The people gathered around the peacekeepers began to realize that violence would not lead to anything good. Kramer, seeing his supporters begin to turn away from him, felt that control was slipping away. Captain Lee took advantage of the moment to move closer to Kramer, his voice calm but insistent. "Kramer, let's talk. We can help you and those with you, but violence is not the answer." Kramer, sensing his supporters were backing down, tried to save face. "I'm not going to listen to you," he shouted, his voice full of despair. "You just want to destroy our community." But the peacekeepers did not retreat. There was understanding and a desire to help in their eyes, and this began to affect the people around them. Some began to stand up and openly discuss how they could continue the peaceful dialogue. "Maybe we really can solve our problems without violence," was heard from the crowd. Kramer, realizing that his words no longer had power, became more aggressive. "I will not let you take what is ours," he shouted, but his voice sounded unconvincing, and there was no longer any confidence in it. Meanwhile, the peacekeepers began to act. They realized that the situation required decisive action. Captain Lee turned to his colleagues. "Prepare the arrest. We need to stop him before the situation gets out of control." As the peacekeepers began to approach Kramer, he felt panic creeping up on him. "You can't stop me. I didn't do anything," he shouted, but his voice no longer sounded so confident. Sophia, noticing that Kramer was starting to lose control, decided to take advantage of the moment. "You all see what's happening," she shouted, addressing the crowd. "We can and must do this peacefully. Don't let hatred take over you." Some of Kramer's supporters began to waver, their resolve weakening. "Maybe she's right," someone in the crowd whispered, and it sounded like a whisper of hope. Kramer, seeing his influence fading, shouted, "Don't listen to her. She's lying." But his words were drowned out by the general hubbub as the peacekeepers finally approached him. "Kramer, we need you to calm down," Captain Lee said, ready for action. "You're under arrest for disorderly conduct and inciting hatred." Kramer, realizing that he could no longer dodge, tried to break free. "I will not give up," he shouted, but his movements became chaotic. The peacekeepers, using their skills, quickly grabbed him and began to put on handcuffs. The crowd held its breath, watching this moment. The news of the arrest quickly spread through the crowd, and people's faces began to change. Fear gave way to relief. Sophia, sensing that the situation was finally starting to change for the better, came closer. "This is our chance. Let's use this moment to continue our dialogue and work together," she shouted, her voice sounding with new strength. As Kramer was led away, his supporters, some of whom were still filled with hatred, began to realize that further action would only make matters worse. "Maybe she's right," one of them said to the others. Captain Lee addressed the crowd. "We are here to help you establish a dialogue and solve your problems. Let us work together for a future free of hatred and violence." Sophia felt hope ignite in people's hearts. This was a moment when they could come together and start a new journey, full of possibilities for change. "We can't miss this chance," she said, and the crowd responded with support. The gathering at the warehouse had transformed into a gathering of hope, and although the road to justice was long, they had already taken the first step towards change. As the crowd began to calm down and the peacekeepers began to talk to people to understand their needs, a new vehicle appeared on the horizon. It was a black SUV with tinted windows. It moved slowly, attracting the attention of everyone around. Sophia noticed some of her supporters start whispering. "Who is that?" she asked. Looking towards the approaching car, people started forming lines, wondering what was going on. Captain Lee also noticed the car and crossed his arms, looking wary. The car stopped and a man in a suit stepped out. It was one Jonathan Reard, a high-profile lawyer known for his support of radical groups and his direct connections to Kramer. His face was confident, and he seemed ready to fight. "What's going on here?" he asked loudly, approaching the crowd, his voice cutting through the tension. "I heard about the riots and I came to find out how to help my people." Kramer, still handcuffed and acting aggressively, shouted. "Jonathan, you came just in time. These people want to destroy us." Riard looked at Kramer, a sly smile spreading across his face. "Don't worry, brother. I'm here to help." He turned to the crowd. "I see you're here to demand your rights. I'm here to support you." Sophia felt the tension rise again. "We don't need your support," she shouted. "We are here to work together and create a peaceful future." But Riard wasn't going to back down that easily. "You don't understand the world you live in," he said, his voice growing more and more commanding. "You need real allies, and I can provide them. These peacekeepers can't help you. They're just distracting you from the real fight." The crowd, still shaken by the recent events, began to waver. Some began to exchange glances, and Sophia realized that Riard could use this moment to his advantage. She stepped forward, trying to speak confidently. "You can say what you want, but we know that hatred will not solve our problems. We do not want violence. Violence is the only language understood by those who hold you in check," Riard replied, his voice full of conviction. "I can teach you how to fight for your rights, but it takes action." Captain Lee stepped closer to Riard. "You have no right to interfere in this matter. We are here to protect peace and order," he said, his tone stern. But Riard, seeing that Kramer was still in handcuffs, began to rock the boat. "Look, your friend is under arrest. That means they want to intimidate you. Don't let them take your power." His words sounded like a call to action. Sophia felt the fear and anger begin to fill the people again. "Don't let him manipulate you," she shouted, her voice filled with new determination. "We must act peacefully, or everything we have achieved will be lost." Kramer, who was still in custody, began shouting, trying to support Riard. "Listen to him. He's right. We have to fight." A tense silence hung in the air. People began to discuss among themselves, and Sophia understood that now everything depended on whether they could unite against this new threat. "We can and must choose the path of peace," she shouted, raising her hands. "We will not surrender to hatred." But Riard, sensing his influence beginning to overshadow her words, stepped forward. "The choice is yours, but if you want someone to stand up for you, you need the right connections. I can help you get what you want." The situation became more and more intriguing, and it soon became obvious that the choice that people had to make could change everything. They had to decide whether to trust in the path of peace or follow Riard and Kramer into a world of aggression and hatred. The crowd was frozen in anticipation, each person feeling that there was a choice in the air that could change their future. Sophia, realizing that this was the decisive moment, took a step forward, her heart pounding with excitement. "We are here because we want justice," she shouted, her voice clear above the general din. "We cannot let hatred prevail. We must fight for our rights, but do so peacefully and with respect." Some of the people gathered around began to nod, their eyes shining with hope, but Riard was not about to give up. "Justice?" he said mockingly. "You think these peacekeepers will solve your problems? They don't understand your pain. They are here to control you, not protect you. You need to know that we can change this ourselves," Sophia replied, trying to keep her emotions in check. "There are many of us, and together we can make real change. We must show that hatred and violence are not the solution." Captain Lee, watching the tension mount, came closer. "We're here to help you. We want to listen to your problems and work on solving them," he said, his voice full of sincerity. "But you need to be patient, too." Riard, seeing that his words were not finding a response, began to get irritated. "You are naive," he shouted, his tone becoming more aggressive. "These peacekeepers will not be able to help you, because they are part of the system that oppresses you. I offer you real support that will help you change everything." Sophia, feeling the tension growing around her, tried to speak with conviction. "We must prove that we can change the world without violence. We can show that we are strong when we act together, based on respect and understanding." Some of her supporters began to come closer, their faces full of determination. "She's right. Let's do this peacefully," came the voices from the crowd, and this caused a wave of approval. Riard, not wanting to give in, shouted, "If you really want change, you need real action. I can show you how to fight. I know people who will help us, but for that, you need to give up these peacekeepers." Sophia realized that she had to be especially careful now. "Let's remember what unites us," she exclaimed. "We don't need allies who bring hatred. We must fight for justice using the strength of our unity, not by fueling aggression." There was silence in the air, and people began to wonder, who were they really? Were they willing to continue the path of hatred, or could they choose love and respect? Every question, every word became decisive. Captain Lee addressed the crowd again. "You are your strength. If you want your voices to be heard, you need to unite and work for a peaceful solution. We are ready to support you, but it is up to you." Sophia felt support begin to mount on her side. "We can create a world where racism and hatred have no place. It's up to us," she shouted, and her words drew a storm of applause. People began to gather around her, their faces glowing with determination. Riard, realizing he was losing control, tried to intervene again. "Don't be fooled. The world won't change on its own," he shouted, but his words were sounding increasingly lonely. The crowd, realizing that they had the power to change, became one. "We want justice. We want change," they shouted, and the cry rang out like a mantra of hope. At that moment, Sophia realized that they could really change the world. "We are together. We will fight for justice. We will say no to racism and hatred," she proclaimed, and that moment became a turning point in their fight. The situation had reached its breaking point, and now that they had made a choice, the future seemed brighter, but there were still obstacles ahead, and their journey was just beginning. The situation in the square became tense. Kramer, realizing that he was losing control, began to twitch in his handcuffs, his aggression increasing. However, the peacekeepers, working together, managed to get him under control. Captain Lee and his colleagues held him tightly, and soon one of them, turning to the crowd, said, "Kramer, you are under arrest for inciting hatred and violence." The crowd held its breath as Kramer was led to a patrol car. His eyes were filled with despair and anger, but no one listened to his screams. "You can't do this. I am your voice," he cried, but those were the last words he could utter before he was carried away. Sophia felt relief fill her heart. "This is our first step towards justice," she shouted, and her words echoed through the crowd, causing responses. People began to applaud and support her, realizing that their efforts were not in vain. Kramer was going to trial. Interest in the case increased significantly. Newspapers and TV stations reported on how his actions had become a symbol of the fight against racism and oppression. People gathered outside the courthouse to support Sophia and all those fighting for justice. The courtroom was tense at the first session of the trial. Many had gathered to watch the proceedings. People held signs with slogans such as "Justice for All" and "No to Racism." They were ready to show that this case was of great importance to their community. Kramer sat in the dock, his face defiant. Defense attorney Jonathan Reard, who tried to speak for him, presented the case as a free speech issue. He argued that Kramer was simply expressing his views and meant no harm. But it was Sophia who spoke for the prosecution. She took the stand, determined and confident. "This case is not just about Kramer," she began. "This case is about racism, about how words can fuel hatred and destroy lives. We are here to say no to that." Sophia's words resonated in the courtroom, and some in attendance began to applaud. "Each of us has the right to live without fear, and we must be willing to fight for it," she continued, her confidence inspiring those around her. The judge nodded, listening attentively. "This case is important to our society. We need to understand how such actions affect people," he said. Sophia, realizing this was her chance, added, "We cannot allow racism to go unpunished. We must show that society will not accept violence and hatred." The trial continued, with each side presenting their evidence. Kramer, feeling his case weakening, tried to remain calm, but there was worry in his eyes. The people outside continued to support Sophia, their cries sounding like a mantra, filling the space with hope. Witnesses soon came forward, people who had suffered at Kramer's hands. Their stories were full of pain and fear, and it left a strong impression on the court. Each of them spoke of how racism had touched their lives, how Kramer's words had caused them to suffer. Sophia knew it was time for change. The trial was not only a battle for justice for Kramer, but also a symbol of the fight against racism. Each new witness confirmed that the world they wanted to create was only possible if they united against hatred and fought for equality. The trial continued, and each day added new chapters to their story of fighting for justice. They knew that their efforts mattered, and that despite all the difficulties, they were moving toward a victory that could change the world. The trial continued, and each day the courtroom became more tense. People gathered to support Sophia and the victims filled every seat, creating an atmosphere of unity and hope. Every time Kramer entered the courtroom, he was looked at with hatred and condemnation. At the next hearing, Attorney Reard tried to establish a defense strategy by calling several witnesses. He brought in people who spoke of their positive interactions with Kramer, trying to paint the image of a victim of the system. "My client is just saying what he thinks," Reard argued, "and he's entitled to his opinion." Sophia and her supporters listened to this testimony with obvious bewilderment. "This is not just an opinion," she whispered to her friends. "This is violence expressed in words. This is part of the system we are trying to destroy." When it was Sophia's turn to testify, she took a deep breath and stepped up to the podium. The scene seemed familiar to her. She had been through many meetings, rallies, and protests before, but now it was more important than ever. "I'm here to tell what happened when Kramer incited violence," she began, her voice full of determination. "His words don't just sound, they act. They incite hatred and violence, and it must stop." Sophia's words reached into the hearts of those present. She spoke of her experiences, of how her friends and family suffered from racism, how hatred expressed in words turned into actions. The room was tensely silent, and everyone listened to her story. Reard, realizing that her testimony could have a huge impact, tried to ask provocative questions. "You say Kramer was inciting hatred, but don't you think it's you and your associates who are inciting conflicts?" "No," Sophia answered with confidence. "We are calling for justice and equality. We want our voices heard, not suppressed. We don't want conflict, we want peace." Reard, sensing that his strategy wasn't working, switched to scare tactics. "Sophia, you do realize that your words can have consequences, right? By inciting hatred in response to hatred, you become part of the problem." The trial was reaching its climax, and the tension in the courtroom was running high. Sophia stood among her fellow judges, determined and hopeful. Every witness, every piece of evidence, and every word spoken in that courtroom mattered. This wasn't just Kramer's case, it was a battle for the rights of all oppressed people and for justice in society. When defense attorney Reard took the stand, he tried to cling to the last threads of his defense. He spoke of free speech, arguing that Kramer was simply expressing his opinions, but his words sounded increasingly hollow as Sophia approached the stand. "We cannot turn a blind eye to what is happening in our society," she began, her voice confident and penetrating. "Words can hurt as much as actions. We are here because we believe in justice. We believe in a world where racism and hatred have no place." The crowd outside the courtroom cheered for her, and it gave her strength. "We are not here just for ourselves, but for future generations, for those who will fight for their rights after us. Each of us deserves to be heard and protected." She continued, "Racism is not just a word. It is a reality that millions of people face every day. We must continue to fight to dismantle the system that allows hatred to grow." The judge, listening intently, nodded, understanding that this case had deep roots. Justice is not just about Kramer's trial. It's about our society becoming a better, more inclusive, and safer place for everyone. As the jury retired to consider its verdict, the courtroom was silent. Everyone waited with bated breath. Time passed, and finally they returned. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Each moment seemed like an eternity. The judge turned to the jury. "Have you come to a decision?" The juror, a middle-aged man, stood up. "We found Kramer guilty of inciting hatred and violence. We believe his actions were not just a mistake, but part of a system we must change." The crowd outside erupted in applause and cheers. People hugged each other, tears of joy streaming down their faces. Sophia felt pride in what they had done. It wasn't just a victory, it was the certainty that their voices had been heard. "This is not the end," she said to her supporters standing nearby. "This is just the beginning. We must continue our fight for justice, for the rights of every person. We cannot allow hatred to fill our streets again." The events in the courtroom became symbolic for many, inspiring people around the world to stand up for their rights and fight against oppression. Sophia knew that their efforts were not in vain, and that every step they took brought them closer to a world where equality and justice would be the norm. The gathering outside turned into a solidarity rally. People shouted slogans, shared stories, and hugged. These moments of unity and support were just what they needed to continue their fight. Sophia knew this was just the first step in a long journey. She decided that she would continue to work with different groups to raise awareness about racism and organize educational programs. She knew they had a lot of work ahead of them, but with each passing day, more and more people joined the movement. Each new story, each new voice that joined their cause, gave her strength. This fight was difficult, but together they were ready to overcome any obstacles. Sophia knew that despite the difficulties, they were capable of more, and this confidence became the basis of their movement, a movement for justice that would never end. Sophia left the courtroom with hope and determination in her heart. The crowd outside greeted her as a hero. People hugged each other. Tears of joy and relief streamed down their faces. Every story, every expression of support strengthened her belief that they were on the right path. "This is not just our victory," she said, addressing the crowd. "This is a step towards change, towards a society where no one suffers from hatred. We must continue our fight to make sure that such incidents do not happen again." With every word Sophia spoke, the joy and determination in the crowd grew. People began sharing their personal stories of racism and struggle. Every voice, every story, added strength to their movement. Sophia knew their work wasn't done. She began planning the next steps, organizing rallies, workshops, creating educational programs to raise awareness of racism and its consequences. She knew it was necessary to work not only with victims, but also with those who could change the system from within. A few weeks later, the first big rally organized by the movement they had created took place. Sophia addressed the crowd, full of energy and inspiration. "We cannot allow hatred to fill our streets again," she said. "Each of us has the right to dignity and respect. Our fight is a fight for everyone." Among the spectators were not only supporters, but also those who doubted, who were looking for answers. Sophia noticed a young man in the crowd who was looking at her with hope. She approached him and asked, "What brought you here?" "I wanted to understand," he replied. "I didn't know what to do, but I see that your fight is important. Each of us can make a contribution," she said. "Don't stand aside. Speak up, act, help others. This is our common cause." With each new rally, with each new voice, their movement grew. People united by a common goal became stronger and louder. Sophia felt that they were not just changing laws, but also the consciousness of society. Finally, after months of effort, they achieved significant legislative change. Laws aimed at combating racism and protecting human rights were passed. It was a major victory, but she knew the road ahead would still be difficult. Sophia looked at her supporters and realized that this was not the end, but a new beginning. "We have taken a step, but the fight continues," she said at the final rally. "We must remain strong and united. Each of us is important. Every action we take matters." And while they would face new challenges, this movement for justice was already part of history that would inspire future generations. Sophia was hopeful and determined to continue this journey. She knew that together they could overcome any challenge. With each new day they became stronger, and this fight for human rights and against racism did not stop. It was not just a story, it was a life full of hope, courage and love. Sophia stood at the podium, surrounded by her supporters, and looked out at the crowd that had gathered for the last rally. It was a time to take stock and celebrate the successes that had been achieved. People from all over the city had come to support the movement, and in their faces she saw hope and determination. "We're here to celebrate our victory," she began, her voice confident, reaching into every heart in the crowd. "But this isn't just our victory, it's a victory for everyone who has ever suffered from racism and injustice. We changed the laws, but most importantly, we changed people's minds." Applause echoed throughout the rally, and Sophia felt a surge of emotion wash over her. She continued, "Each of us here is a witness, a voice. Your stories and your courage have made what we see today possible. You have helped shine a light on issues that have been in the shadows for too long." The crowd erupted in applause once again, and Sophia, inspired by their support, decided to share the next steps. "But this is just the beginning. We must continue our movement, continue to educate and educate. Each of us can be the change we want to see in the world." In the audience, she noticed a young woman who raised her hand. "What can we do next?" she asked, full of genuine interest. "That's a great question," Sophia replied, smiling. "There are many ways. Participate in community meetings, organize your own actions, share information on social media. We can create a network of support and assistance to help those who experience racism." Sophia turned her attention to the small group of teenagers who had come with signs. They seemed full of enthusiasm and determination. "You are the future, and your participation is critical," she told them. "Your voices, your ideas, are what will help us continue the fight for justice." As the rally continued, each new speaker shared their stories and ideas. Each voice added to the larger picture, showing how many people were willing to come together for a common goal. It was an amazing sight, and Sophia knew they were building more than just a movement, they were creating a community willing to support each other. As the rally came to an end and people began to leave, Sophia felt that their efforts were truly changing the world. She thought about what still needed to be done. The laws passed and their support were supposed to be the beginning of deeper work on changing mentalities, on education and culture. A few months passed, and Sophia organized a series of educational workshops where she shared knowledge about racism, its history and consequences. Each workshop brought together more people who wanted to learn more and be part of the change. It became a place where people could share experiences, find support and unite for further action. She also began working with local schools to implement programs on human rights and diversity. She believed that by starting with the younger generation, they could create a more tolerant society where hatred would have no place. One day, when Sophia was preparing for another seminar, she received a message from one of the participants, who wrote, "I never thought that I could change anything, but thanks to you, I found my power. Thank you for inspiring us." These words touched Sophia. She understood that every action, every word mattered, and although the fight for justice would never be easy, she knew that together they could achieve anything. As time went on, their movement became more and more visible in society. People began to pay attention to the problems of racism, and discussions in public places became more and more open. Sophia and her like-minded people knew that they had changed not only laws, but also hearts and minds. The story of Sophia and her community's struggle was not over. Each new day brought new challenges, but together they were ready to face them. They knew that the importance of justice and the rights of every person would never fade. Sophia smiled as she looked at the people around her. They were part of something bigger, and that connection was their strength. And though the road was long, it was full of hope and courage that united them all. Sophia stood among her fellow believers, and there was an atmosphere of hope and unity. She realized that their efforts were not in vain, that every step brought them closer to a more just society. Rallies, seminars and discussions became an integral part of their lives. As time passed, the movement for justice that began with a single voice grew into a powerful stream of change. Laws continued to improve, educational programs reached more people, and public debate became more open. Sophia knew the fight wasn't over, but she also knew that every step was a step toward a brighter future. Their shared goal was to build a world free of hatred and prejudice, and although the path would be difficult, together they were ready for any challenge. Looking back on the journey, Sophia smiled. She knew that each of them had become part of the story, and now they were not just dreamers, they were active changemakers. As if in response to her thoughts, the crowd burst into applause. Sophia raised her hands in support, and in that moment, she realized that their fight for justice was just beginning. With hope and determination in her heart, she said, "We will fight until the world becomes a place where everyone is equal." And as she left the rally, she knew that with each passing day, their movement would grow and strengthen. They weren't just hoping for change, they were creating it, and this was just the beginning. Thank you for being with us and following the story. It is very important for us to know your opinion. What do you think about the fight for justice and rights against racism? Share your thoughts in the comments. Each of your responses is very valuable to us. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like it so you don't miss new stories. We appreciate each of you and are grateful for your support. Have a great day and be inspired on your path to justice.